Being and Time by Martin Heidegger. Translated by John Macquarie and Edward Robinson. Read by Martin Swain for Ukemi Audiobooks.
An Introduction to Heidegger's Being and Time, written and read by Taylor Carman, Professor of Philosophy, Barnard College, Columbia University. Being and Time is one of the great masterpieces of 20th century philosophy. Written in the Weimar period of German history between the two world wars, it became the primary source of what was already then known as existentialism, or existence philosophy, though its author, Martin Heidegger, always rejected that label. Its influence has been felt in one way or another by all subsequent movements in European philosophy and by analytic philosophy in the English-speaking world, if often highly critically. The text is notoriously difficult to read, but no more so than the classic works of Aristotle or Hegel, not to mention the more recent writings of the French post-structuralists who have defined themselves in relation to Heidegger's thought. Who was Martin Heidegger, and what is Being and Time, his magnum opus, about? In his lectures on Aristotle, Heidegger famously told his students that Aristotle lived, thought, and died, and that is all you need to know about him. What matters is not the man, but the work. Heidegger himself has been called a man without a biography, and while that is of course hyperbolic, it is probably better to begin with the book rather than the man. Being and Time addresses a seemingly simple question. What does it mean to be? This question of being is maximally general. It asks of anything that is what it means that it is. But surely the notion of being, what we mean when we say is, or am, or are, is so basic, so primitive, that nothing more can be said about it. Surely we can't give a philosophical definition of the meaning of being in the way in which dictionaries offer definitions of words. And yet, Heidegger says, we all understand it, more or less. We know that a house exists, and we know that before it was built it didn't exist, and that after it burns down it no longer exists. We know that cities and religions and artworks and prime numbers exist. Perhaps most importantly, we know that we exist, and we know that we didn't always exist, but came into existence, and that we will cease to exist when we die. What do we know when we know these things? Heidegger tells us that Being and Time, a hefty tome of more than 400 pages, divided in two halves, Division 1 and Division 2, offers only a preliminary approach to that question. It answers it only tentatively by suggesting that we always understand being somehow in terms of time. The book, however, does not directly address the general question of being, but instead describes the one thing, the unique entity that, as we have just seen, understands being, if only roughly, namely us. Human beings exist, and are moreover the only existing things, as far as we know, with an understanding of what it is for anything to exist, including themselves. Indeed, Heidegger argues, that understanding of being is precisely what makes us us. He therefore does not refer to us by any of the traditional names familiar from the history of philosophy: man, person, soul, mind, spirit, consciousness, Homo sapiens. His term for us is instead Dasein, an ordinary German word for existence, but whose literal meaning is being there. Our being, Heidegger says, is being in the world. We don't first exist and only then subsequently come into the world, or encounter it fresh. Rather, as soon as we are there in the world, we find ourselves already having been there, thrown into the world, Heidegger says. It is our thrownness that grounds our sense of having a past. We are always already there in the world. But that much is only, at best, half the story, for we are also always already pressing or projecting into actions, projects, goals, purposes, things we somehow aim at and that give our lives shape, direction, and meaning. For just as we don't first of all exist and then bump into a world external to us, Likewise, we don't first exist and then subsequently form intentions, make plans, and perform actions as something, as it were, extra. For Dasein, to be is to be already thrown into the world, but it is also always to be projecting into possibilities that constitute our understanding of who we are. A rebellious teenager, an aspiring poet, a loyal citizen, a clever entrepreneur, a disappointed idealist. This projection into possibilities is what grounds our sense of having a future. We are not confined to an isolated present moment, but are always ahead of ourselves. The second half of Being in Time, that is, Division 2, moves from an account of these fundamental structures of being in the world to a description of what it means for Dasein to exist, as Heidegger says, authentically or inauthentically. Authenticity is not the opposite of fake or unreal, as, for example, an authentic Rembrandt painting is not a forgery, or an authentic diamond is not just a piece of glass. Instead, living authentically means living your life as your own, owning it, as we say, owning up to your situation and your commitments. It is not exactly being true to yourself, since that suggests that you already have an identity prior to taking up your commitments. But you don't. It is your commitments that make you who you are, and authenticity means taking those commitments seriously, whether by embracing them wholeheartedly or abandoning them resolutely in favor of some other way of living. Living inauthentically, by contrast, means living according to custom and doing as one does, that is, in compliance with the average, generic standards of everyday normality. Conforming to public norms is not itself a bad thing. With no commitment to shared standards of intelligibility and rightness, after all, social life would come grinding to a halt. But merely living your life as one is supposed to falls short of embracing your existence as your own, for you must live your own life, and no one else can live it for you. Nor, even more poignantly, can anyone else die your death for you. Our being, Heidegger says in the first chapter of Division 2 of Being in Time, is essentially a being toward death, and my death individualizes me, just as my body and my life are irreducibly mine, unlike things I can transfer to others, such as money and possessions, or even the privileges of rank and status in the social world. To relate to death inauthentically is to console oneself with the, after all perfectly correct, thought that everyone dies, and therefore so do I, just like anyone. Dying authentically means owning your life as fragile and precious precisely because you know it will collapse into nothing. That might sound gloomy, but Heidegger insists it is simply what we all know to be the truth about our existence, unless we are evading it or fleeing from it, as we often do. Indeed, Heidegger insists, we all know that a delicate mixture of circumstance and choice is what our existence amounts to, even if we choose to believe in a life after death, for no such belief in immortality would even be intelligible if we did not first grasp the poignancy and inevitability of our demise. For Heidegger, then, owning up to the uniqueness and impermanence of existence in light of the singularity of death is a necessary condition of living well by whatever standards we judge it so, whether aesthetic, moral, or religious. One of the central themes running through Being in Time is the idea that Dasein's existence is pervaded by a primordial kind of anxiety, or Angst. By that word, Heidegger does not mean anything merely psychological. It is not that we are fundamentally nervous, worried, or depressed. Far from it. For the most part, we are fairly comfortable in our daily routines. To say that we are deeply and essentially anxious, instead, is to say that we are attuned to the unsettledness or uncanniness, the Unheimlichkeit, of our existence. We are, and we know we are, so to speak, never fully at home in the world, never unproblematically settled in and defined by our situations, our commitments, our identities. Our lives are contingent, dependent, and vulnerable to disruption and collapse. The final chapters of Division 2 of Being in Time thus describe the temporal structure of human finitude, which Heidegger calls the structure of care, which is in turn the meaning of Dasein's being. To be a human being is to care about something, for something to matter to us. Obviously, we care about ourselves and each other, but we also take care of animals and tools and the material and social environments in which we live. For us, to be is to care, and the structure of care is a temporal structure, stretching from the thrownness of our birth to the finality of our death. Heidegger inherited much of this sense of the drama of human existence from his Danish precursor, Søren Kierkegaard, and he handed it down in turn to Jean-Paul Sartre, the leading figure of French existentialism in the middle of the century. The existential themes of being and time, however, began to give way in Heidegger's writings to a different perspective and a different set of concerns during and after the Second World War. Where being and time focused on individual existence, his later works give pride of place to more collective, impersonal phenomena such as history, culture, art, language, science, and technology. And in stark contrast to the hefty scholarly treatise before you, Heidegger came to write almost exclusively shorter essays and lectures, favoring thematic specificity over systematic completeness. Heidegger's thought was also crucially shaped by the one historical event that will forever be remembered as an essential part of his biography, and that is his enthusiastic support for Hitler and National Socialism, beginning in 1933 when he served for 1 year as rector of Freiburg University. That support waned, but had not disappeared altogether by the time war broke out in 1939. Heidegger's nationalism and anti-Semitism, once matters of rumor and controversy, are now undeniable facts and permanent stains on his character and reputation. What is less clear is whether his political actions and attitudes in the 1930s and 40s cast a shadow back on the text of Being and Time, which was written in the previous decade. Late in the book, he writes at a high level of philosophical abstraction about the historical life of a community or people, a folk. But by that he means any and all human communities in the world and throughout history, not just the nations of modern Europe, or specifically Weimar Germany. In other lectures and essays before and during the war, Heidegger occasionally tosses political asides and allusions into the philosophical discussion. In Being and Time, he does not. The theme is human existence, at any time and in any place. The specificity of modern politics simply does not enter into the argument of the book. In his later works, Heidegger approaches the question of being not by way of the analytic of Dasein, as in Being and Time, but through what we might call Socratic questions, questions of the form, what is X? For example, what is art? That is, what makes a work of art a work of art? What is language? What is poetry? What is technology? In each case, Heidegger says, these questions attune us to the more general, but now, he thinks, ultimately unanswerable question, what is it for anything to be? Heidegger began his philosophical career trying to conceive of an answer, or at least the general form of an answer to that question. Being and Time is the fruit of that effort. Later, he arrived at the view that different cultures in different historical epochs supply their own different answers, and that beyond that diversity of understandings of being, our wonderment, our sense of awe in the face of the question, is itself as close as we can get to an understanding of the meaning of being.
You can download a PDF containing the transcription of Professor Taylor Carman's introduction from Audible. Also included on the PDF are the contents to Being and Time, which may assist listening to the recorded text. Now, Martin Swain reads Being and Time by Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger. Being and Time. Delon gar hosumeis mentauta, tipote boleste semainen, hopotan on fengeste. Palae gignoscete, emeis de prutumen uumetha, nun de porecamen. For manifestly you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed. Plato, Sophist. Do we, in our time, have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being? Not at all. So it is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. But are we nowadays even perplexed at our inability to understand the expression being? Not at all. So first of all we must reawaken an understanding for the meaning of this question. Our aim in the following treatise is to work out the question of the meaning of being, and to do so concretely. Our provisional aim is the interpretation of time as the possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being. But the reasons for making this our aim, the investigations which such a purpose requires, and the path to its achievement, call for some introductory remarks. Introduction. Exposition of the question of the meaning of being. 1. The necessity, structure, and priority of the question of being. Section 1. The necessity for explicitly restating the question of being. This question has, today, been forgotten. Even though in our time we deem it progressive to give our approval to metaphysics again, it is held that we have been exempted from the exertions of a newly rekindled gigantomachia perites ousias, battle of giants concerning being, Plato. Yet the question we are touching upon is not just any question. It is one which provided a stimulus for the researches of Plato and Aristotle, only to subside from then on as a theme for actual investigation. What these two men achieved was to persist through many alterations and retouchings down to the logic of Hegel, and what they wrested with the utmost intellectual effort from the phenomena, fragmentary and incipient though it was, has long since become trivialized. Not only that, on the basis of the Greeks' initial contributions towards an interpretation of being, a dogma has been developed which not only declares the question about the meaning of being to be superfluous, but sanctions its complete neglect. It is said that being is the most universal and the emptiest of concepts. As such, it resists every attempt at definition. Nor does this most universal and hence indefinable concept require any definition, for everyone uses it constantly and already understands what he means by it. In this way, that which the ancient philosophers found continually disturbing as something obscure and hidden has taken on a clarity and self-evidence such that if anyone continues to ask about it, he is charged with an error of method. At the beginning of our investigation, it is not possible to give a detailed account of the presuppositions and prejudices which are constantly reimplanting and fostering the belief that an inquiry into being is unnecessary. They are rooted in ancient ontology itself, and it will not be possible to interpret that ontology adequately until the question of being has been clarified and answered and taken as a clue, at least if we are to have regard for the soil from which the basic ontological concepts developed, and if we are to see whether the categories have been demonstrated in a way that is appropriate and complete. We shall therefore carry the discussion of these presuppositions only to the point at which the necessity for restating the question about the meaning of being become plain. There are three such presuppositions. 1. First, it has been maintained that being is the most universal concept, Aristotle, Metaphysics. An understanding of being is already included in conceiving anything which one apprehends as an entity, Aquinas, Summa Theologica. But the universality of being is not that of a class or genus. The term being does not define that realm of entities which is uppermost when these are articulated conceptually according to genus and species. To on esti katolu malista panton. Being is a genus, Aristotle. The universality of being transcends any universality of genus. In medieval ontology, being is designated as a transcendens. Aristotle himself knew the unity of this transcendental universal as a unity of analogy, in contrast to the multiplicity of the highest generic concepts applicable to things. With this discovery, in spite of his dependence on the way in which the ontological question had been formulated by Plato, he put the problem of being on what was in principle a new basis. To be sure, even Aristotle failed to clear away the darkness of these categorical interconnections. In medieval ontology this problem was widely discussed, especially in the Thomist and Scotist schools, without reaching clarity as to principles. And when Hegel at last defines being as the indeterminate immediate, and makes this definition basic for all the further categorical explications of his logic, he keeps looking in the same direction as ancient ontology, except that he no longer pays heed to Aristotle's problem of the unity of being as over against the multiplicity of categories applicable to things. So, if it is said that being is the most universal concept, this cannot mean that it is the one which is clearest, or that it needs no further discussion. It is rather the darkest of all. 2. It has been maintained, secondly, that the concept of being is indefinable. This is deduced from its supreme universality, and rightly so, if definitio fit per genus proximum et differentiam specificam. Definition is the result of the nearest genus and specific difference. Being cannot indeed be conceived as an entity. Enti non additur aliqua natura. No other nature can be added to being, nor can it acquire such a character as to have the term entity applied to it. Being cannot be derived from higher concepts by definition, nor can it be presented through lower ones. But does this imply that being no longer offers a problem? Not at all. We can infer only that being cannot have the character of an entity. Thus we cannot apply to being the concept of definition as presented in traditional logic, which itself has its foundations in ancient ontology, and which, within certain limits, provides a quite justifiable way of defining entities. The indefinability of being does not eliminate the question of its meaning. It demands that we look that question in the face. 3. Thirdly, it is held that being is of all concepts the one that is self-evident. Whenever one cognizes anything or makes an assertion, whenever one comports oneself towards entities, even towards oneself, some use is made of being, and this expression is held to be intelligible without further ado, just as everyone understands the sky is blue, I am merry, and the like. But here we have an average kind of intelligibility which merely demonstrates that this is unintelligible. It makes manifest that in any way of comporting oneself towards entities as entities, even in any being towards entities as entities, there lies a priori an enigma. The very fact that we already live in an understanding of being and that the meaning of being is still veiled in darkness proves that it is necessary in principle to raise this question again. Within the range of basic philosophical concepts, especially when we come to the concept of being, it is a dubious procedure to invoke self-evidence, even if the self-evident, Kant's covert judgments of the common reason, is to become the sole explicit and abiding theme for one's analytic, the business of philosophers. By considering these prejudices, however, we have made plain not only that the question of being lacks an answer, but that the question itself is obscure and without direction. So, if it is to be revived, this means that we must first work out an adequate way of formulating it. Section 2. The formal structure of the question of being. The question of the meaning of being must be formulated. If it is a fundamental question, or indeed the fundamental question, it must be made transparent, and in an appropriate way. We must therefore explain briefly what belongs to any question whatsoever, so that, from this standpoint, the question of being can be made visible as a very special one, with its own distinctive character. Every inquiry is a seeking, suchen. Every seeking gets guided beforehand by what is sought. Inquiry is a cognizant seeking for an entity, both with regard to the fact that it is and with regard to its being as it is. This cognizant seeking can take the form of investigating, untersuchen, in which one lays bare that which the question is about, and ascertains its character. Any inquiry, as an inquiry about something, has that which is asked about, sein Gefragtes. But all inquiry about something is somehow a questioning of something, Anfragen bei. So in addition to what is asked about, an inquiry has that which is interrogated, ein Befragtes. In investigative questions, that is, in questions which are specifically theoretical, what is asked about is determined and conceptualized. Furthermore, in what is asked about there lies also that which is to be found out by the asking, das Erfragte. This is what is really intended. With this, the inquiry reaches its goal. Inquiry itself is the behavior of a questioner, and therefore of an entity, and as such has its own character of being. When one makes an inquiry, one may do so just casually, or one may formulate the question explicitly. The latter case is peculiar in that the inquiry does not become transparent to itself until all these constitutive factors of the question have themselves become transparent. The question about the meaning of being is to be formulated. We must therefore discuss it with an eye to these structural items. Inquiry, as a kind of seeking, must be guided beforehand by what is sought. So the meaning of being must already be available to us in some way. As we have intimated, we always conduct our activities in an understanding of being. Out of this understanding arise both the explicit question of the meaning of being and the tendency that leads us towards its conception. We do not know what being means, but even if we ask, what is being, we keep within an understanding of the is, though we are unable to fix conceptually what that is signifies. We do not even know the horizon in terms of which that meaning is to be grasped and fixed. But this vague average understanding of being is still a fact. However much this understanding of being, an understanding which is already available to us, may fluctuate and grow dim, and border on mere acquaintance with a word, its very indefiniteness is itself a positive phenomenon, which needs to be clarified. An investigation of the meaning of being cannot be expected to give this clarification at the outset. If we are to obtain the clue we need for interpreting this average understanding of being, we must first develop the concept of being. In the light of this concept and the ways in which it may be explicitly understood, we can make out what this obscured or still unillumined understanding of being means, and what kinds of obscuration, or hindrance to an explicit illumination, of the meaning of being are possible and even inevitable. Further, this vague average understanding of being may be so infiltrated with traditional theories and opinions about being that these remain hidden as sources of the way in which it is prevalently understood. What we seek when we inquire into being is not something entirely unfamiliar, even if proximally we cannot grasp it at all. In the question which we are to work out, what is asked about is being, that which determines entities as entities, that on the basis of which, woraufhin, entities are already understood. However, we may discuss them in detail. The being of entities is not itself an entity. If we are to understand the problem of being, our first philosophical step consists in not telling a story, that is to say, in not defining entities as entities by tracing them back in their origin to some other entities, as if being had the character of some possible entity. Hence, being, as that which is asked about, must be exhibited in a way of its own, essentially different from the way in which entities are discovered. Accordingly, what is to be found out by the asking, the meaning of being, also demands that it be conceived in a way of its own, essentially contrasting with the concepts in which entities acquire their determinate signification. Insofar as being constitutes what is asked about, and being means the being of entities, then entities themselves turn out to be what is interrogated. These are, so to speak, questioned as regards their being. But if the characteristics of their being can be yielded without falsification, then these entities must, on their part, have become accessible as they are in themselves. When we come to what is to be interrogated, the question of being, requires that the right way of access to entities shall have been obtained and secured in advance. But there are many things which we designate as being, seiend, and we do so in various senses. Everything we talk about, everything we have in view, everything towards which we comport ourselves in any way, is being. What we are is being, and so is how we are. Being lies in the fact that something is, and in its being as it is, in reality, in presence at hand, in subsistence, in validity, in Dasein, in the there is. In which entities is the meaning of being to be discerned? From which entities is the disclosure of being to take its departure? Is the starting point optional, or does some particular entity have priority when we come to work out the question of being? Which entity shall we take for our example, and in what sense does it have priority? If the question about being is to be explicitly formulated and carried through in such a manner as to be completely transparent to itself, then any treatment of it in line with the elucidations we have given requires us to explain how being is to be looked at, how its meaning is to be understood and conceptually grasped. It requires us to prepare the way for choosing the right entity for our example, and to work out the genuine way of access to it. Looking at something, understanding and conceiving it, choosing access to it, all these ways of behaving are constitutive for our inquiry, and therefore are modes of being for those particular entities which we, the inquirers, are ourselves. Thus, to work out the question of being adequately, we must make an entity, the inquirer, transparent in his own being. The very asking of this question is an entity's mode of being, and as such it gets its essential character from what is inquired about, namely, being. This entity, which each of us is himself, and which includes inquiring as one of the possibilities of its being, we shall denote by the term Dasein. If we are to formulate our question explicitly and transparently, we must first give a proper explication of an entity, Dasein, with regard to its being. Is there not, however, a manifest circularity in such an undertaking? If we must first define an entity in its being, and if we want to formulate the question of being only on this basis, what is this but going in a circle? In working out our question, have we not presupposed something which only the answer can bring? Formal objections, such as the argument about circular reasoning, which can easily be cited at any time in the study of first principles, are always sterile when one is considering concrete ways of investigating. When it comes to understanding the matter at hand, they carry no weight, and keep us from penetrating into the field of study. But factically, there is no circle at all in formulating our question as we have described. One can determine the nature of entities in their being without necessarily having the explicit concept of the meaning of being at one's disposal. Otherwise there could have been no ontological knowledge heretofore. One would hardly deny that factically there has been such knowledge. Of course, being has been presupposed in all ontology up till now, but not as a concept at one's disposal, not as the sort of thing we are seeking. This presupposing of being has rather the character of taking a look at it beforehand, so that in the light of it the entities presented to us get provisionally articulated in their being. This guiding activity of taking a look at being arises from the average understanding of being in which we always operate, and which in the end belongs to the essential constitution of Dasein itself. Such presupposing has nothing to do with laying down an axiom from which a sequence of propositions is deductively derived. It is quite impossible for there to be any circular argument in formulating the question about the meaning of being. For in answering this question, the issue is not one of grounding something by such a derivation. It is rather one of laying bare the grounds for it and exhibiting them. In the question of the meaning of being there is no circular reasoning, but rather a remarkable relatedness backward or forward, which what we are asking about, being, bears to the inquiry itself as a mode of being of an entity. Here what is asked about has an essential pertinence to the inquiry itself, and this belongs to the ownmost meaning, eigensten Sinn, of the question of being. This only means, however, that there is a way, perhaps even a very special one, in which entities with the character of Dasein are related to the question of being. But have we not thus demonstrated that a certain kind of entity has a priority with regard to its being? And have we not thus presented that entity which shall serve as the primary example to be interrogated in the question of being? So far, our discussion has not demonstrated Dasein's priority, nor has it shown decisively whether Dasein may possibly or even necessarily serve as the primary entity to be interrogated. But indeed something like a priority of Dasein has announced itself. Section 3. The ontological priority of the question of being. When we pointed out the characteristics of the question of being, taking as our clue the formal structure of the question as such, we made it clear that this question is a peculiar one, in that a series of fundamental considerations is required for working it out, not to mention for solving it. But its distinctive features will come fully to light only when we have delimited it adequately with regard to its function, its aim, and its motives. Hitherto our arguments for showing that the question must be restated have been motivated in part by its venerable origin, but chiefly by the lack of a definite answer and even by the absence of any satisfactory formulation of the question itself. One may, however, ask what purpose this question is supposed to serve. Does it simply remain, or is it at all, a mere matter for soaring speculation about the most general of generalities? Or is it rather, of all questions, both the most basic and the most concrete? Being is always the being of an entity. The totality of entities can, in accordance with its various domains, become a field for laying bare and delimiting certain definite areas of subject matter. These areas, on their part, for instance, history, nature, space, life, Dasein, language, and the like, can serve as objects which corresponding scientific investigations may take as their respective themes. Scientific research accomplishes, roughly and naively, the demarcation and initial fixing of the areas of subject matter. The basic structures of any such area have already been worked out after a fashion in our pre-scientific ways of experiencing and interpreting that domain of being in which the area of subject matter is itself confined. The basic concepts, which thus arise, remain our proximal clues for disclosing this area concretely for the first time. And although research may always lean towards this positive approach, its real progress comes not so much from collecting results and storing them away in manuals, as from inquiring into the ways in which each particular area is basically constituted, Grundverfassungen, an inquiry to which we have been driven mostly by reacting against just such an increase in information. The real movement of the sciences takes place when their basic concepts undergo a more or less radical revision, which is transparent to itself. The level which a science has reached is determined by how far it is capable of a crisis in its basic concepts. In such immanent crises, the very relationship between positively investigative inquiry and those things themselves that are under interrogation comes to a point where it begins to totter. Among the various disciplines everywhere today, there are freshly awakened tendencies to put research on new foundations. Mathematics, which is seemingly the most rigorous and most firmly constructed of the sciences, has reached a crisis in its foundations. In the controversy between the formalists and the intuitionists, the issue is one of obtaining and securing the primary way of access to what are supposedly the objects of this science. The relativity theory of physics arises from the tendency to exhibit the interconnectedness of nature as it is in itself. As a theory of the conditions under which we have access to nature itself, it seeks to preserve the changelessness of the laws of motion by ascertaining all relativities, and thus comes up against the question of the structure of its own given area of study, the problem of matter. In biology, there is an awakening tendency to inquire beyond the definitions which mechanism and vitalism have given for life and organism, and to define anew the kind of being which belongs to the living as such. In those humane sciences which are historiological in character, the urge towards historical actuality itself has been strengthened in the course of time by tradition and by the way tradition has been presented and handed down. The history of literature is to become the history of problems. Theology is seeking a more primordial interpretation of man's being towards God, prescribed by the meaning of faith itself and remaining within it. It is slowly beginning to understand once more Luther's insight that the foundation on which its system of dogma rests has not arisen from an inquiry in which faith is primary, and that conceptually this foundation not only is inadequate for the problematic of theology, but conceals and distorts it. Basic concepts determine the way in which we get an understanding beforehand of the area of subject matter underlying all the objects a science takes as its theme, and all positive investigation is guided by this understanding. Only after the area itself has been explored beforehand, in a corresponding manner, do these concepts become genuinely demonstrated and grounded. But since every such area is itself obtained from the domain of entities themselves, this preliminary research, from which the basic concepts are drawn, signifies nothing else than an interpretation of those entities with regard to their basic state of being. Such research must run ahead of the positive sciences, and it can. Here the work of Plato and Aristotle is evidence enough. Laying the foundations for the sciences in this way is different in principle from the kind of logic which limps along after, investigating the status of some science as it chances to find it, in order to discover its method. Laying the foundations, as we have described it, is rather a productive logic, in the sense that it leaps ahead, as it were, into some area of being, discloses it for the first time in the constitution of its being, and after thus arriving at the structures within it, makes these available to the positive sciences as transparent assignments for their inquiry. To give an example, what is philosophically primary is neither a theory of the concept formation of historiology, nor the theory of historiological knowledge, nor yet the theory of history as the object of historiology. What is primary is rather the interpretation of authentically historical entities as regards their historicality. Similarly, the positive outcome of Kant's critique of pure reason lies in what it has contributed towards the working out of what belongs to any nature whatsoever, not in a theory of knowledge. His transcendental logic is an a priori logic for the subject matter of that area of being called nature. But such an inquiry itself, ontology taken in the widest sense without favouring any particular ontological directions or tendencies, requires a further clue. Ontological inquiry is indeed more primordial, as over against the ontical inquiry of the positive sciences. But it remains itself naive and opaque, if in its researches into the being of entities, it fails to discuss the meaning of being in general, and even the ontological task of constructing a non-deductive genealogy of the different possible ways of being requires that we first come to an understanding of what we really mean by this expression, being. The question of being aims therefore at ascertaining the a priori conditions not only for the possibility of the sciences which examine entities as entities of such and such a type, and in so doing already operate with an understanding of being, but also for the possibility of those ontologies themselves which are prior to the ontical sciences, and which provide their foundations. Basically, all ontology, no matter how rich and how firmly compacted a system of categories it has at its disposal, remains blind and perverted from its ownmost aim, if it has not first adequately clarified the meaning of being, and conceived this clarification as its fundamental task. Ontological research itself, when properly understood, gives to the question of being an ontological priority which goes beyond mere resumption of a venerable tradition and advancement with a problem that has hitherto been opaque. But this objectively scientific priority is not the only one. Section 4. The ontical priority of the question of being. Science in general may be defined as the totality established through an interconnection of true propositions. This definition is not complete, nor does it reach the meaning of science. As ways in which man behaves, sciences have the manner of being, which this entity, man himself, possesses. This entity we denote by the term Dasein. Scientific research is not the only manner of being which this entity can have, nor is it the one which lies closest. Moreover, Dasein itself has a special distinctiveness as compared with other entities, and it is worth our while to bring this to view in a provisional way. Here our discussion must anticipate later analyses in which our results will be authentically exhibited for the first time. Dasein is an entity which does not just occur among other entities. Rather, it is ontically distinguished by the fact that, in its very being, that being is an issue for it. But in that case, this is a constitutive state of Dasein's being, and this implies that Dasein, in its being, has a relationship towards that being, a relationship which itself is one of being. And this means further that there is some way in which Dasein understands itself in its being, and that, to some degree, it does so explicitly. It is peculiar to this entity that with and through its being, this being is disclosed to it. Understanding of being is itself a definite characteristic of Dasein's being. Dasein is ontically distinctive in that it is ontological. Here, being ontological is not yet tantamount to developing an ontology. So, if we should reserve the term ontology for that theoretical inquiry which is explicitly devoted to the meaning of entities, then what we have in mind in speaking of Dasein's being ontological is to be designated as something pre-ontological. It does not signify simply being ontical, however, but rather being in such a way that one has an understanding of being. That kind of being towards which Dasein can comport itself in one way or another, and always does comport itself somehow, we call existence, Existenz. And because we cannot define Dasein's essence by citing a what of the kind that pertains to a subject matter, eines sachhaltigen was, and because its essence lies rather in the fact that in each case it has its being to be, and has it as its own, we have chosen to designate this entity as Dasein, a term which is purely an expression of its being, als reiner Seinsausdruck. Dasein always understands itself in terms of its existence, in terms of a possibility of itself, to be itself or not itself. Dasein has either chosen these possibilities itself or got itself into them or grown up in them already. Only the particular Dasein decides its existence, whether it does so by taking hold or by neglecting. The question of existence never gets straightened out, except through existing itself. The understanding of oneself which leads along this way we call existentiell. The question of existence is one of Dasein's ontical affairs. This does not require that the ontological structure of existence should be theoretically transparent. The question about the structure aims at the analysis, Auseinanderlegung, of what constitutes existence. The context, Zusammenhang, of such structures we call existentiality. Its analytic, has the character of an understanding which is not existentiel, but rather existential. The task of an existential analytic of Dasein has been delineated in advance, as regards both its possibility and its necessity, in Dasein's ontical constitution. So far as existence is the determining character of Dasein, the ontological analytic of this entity always requires that existentiality be considered beforehand. By existentiality we understand the state of being that is constitutive for those entities that exist. But in the idea of such a constitutive state of being, the idea of being is already included, and thus even the possibility of carrying through the analytic of Dasein depends on working out beforehand the question about the meaning of being in general. Sciences are ways of being in which Dasein comports itself towards entities which it need not be itself. But to Dasein, being in a world is something that belongs essentially. Thus, Dasein's understanding of being pertains with equal primordiality both to an understanding of something like a world and to the understanding of the being of those entities which become accessible within the world. So whenever an ontology takes for its theme entities whose character of being is other than that of Dasein, it has its own foundation and motivation in Dasein's own ontical structure, in which a pre-ontological understanding of being is comprised as a definite characteristic. Therefore, fundamental ontology, from which alone all other ontologies can take their rise, must be sought in the existential analytic of Dasein. Dasein accordingly takes priority over all other entities in several ways. The first priority is an ontical one. Dasein is an entity whose being has the determinate character of existence. The second priority is an ontological one. Dasein is in itself ontological, because existence is thus determinative for it. But with equal primordiality, Dasein also possesses, as constitutive for its understanding of existence, an understanding of the being of all entities of a character other than its own. Dasein has therefore a third priority as providing the ontico-ontological condition for the possibility of any ontologies. Thus Dasein has turned out to be, more than any other entity, the one which must first be interrogated ontologically. But the roots of the existential analytic on its part are ultimately existentiel, that is, ontical. Only if the inquiry of philosophical research is itself seized upon in an existentiel manner, as a possibility of the being of each existing Dasein, does it become at all possible to disclose the existentiality of existence, and to undertake an adequately founded ontological problematic. But with this, the ontical priority of the question of being has also become plain. Dasein's ontico-ontological priority was seen quite early, though Dasein itself was not grasped in its genuine ontological structure, and did not even become a problem in which this structure was sought. Aristotle says, «He psyche ta ontapos estin». Man's soul is, in a certain way, entities. The soul, which makes up the being of man, has aesthesis, perception, and noesis, thought, among its ways of being, and in these it discovers all entities, both in the fact that they are, and in their being as they are, that is always, in their being. Aristotle's principle, which points back to the ontological thesis of Parmenides, is one which Thomas Aquinas has taken up in a characteristic discussion. Thomas is engaged in the task of deriving the transcendentia, those characters of being which lie beyond every possible way in which an entity may be classified as coming under some generic kind of subject matter, every modus specialis entis, special mode of being, and which belong necessarily to anything, whatever it may be. Thomas has to demonstrate that the verum, the true, is such a transcendens, such a transcendent thing. He does this by invoking an entity which, in accordance with its very manner of being, is properly suited to come together with entities of any sort whatever. this distinctive entity, the ens quod natum est convenire cum omni ente, an entity which is born to come together with any entity, Aristotle, is the soul, anima. Here the priority of Dasein over all other entities emerges, although it has not been ontologically clarified. This priority has obviously nothing in common with a vicious subjectivizing of the totality of entities. By indicating Dasein's ontico-ontological priority in this provisional manner, we have grounded our demonstration that the question of being is ontico-ontologically distinctive. But when we analyzed the structure of this question as such, we came up against a distinctive way in which this entity functions in the very formulation of that question. Dasein then revealed itself as that entity which must first be worked out in an ontologically adequate manner, if the inquiry is to become a transparent one. But now it has been shown that the ontological analytic of Dasein in general is what makes up fundamental ontology, so that Dasein functions as that entity which in principle is to be interrogated beforehand as to its being. If to interpret the meaning of being becomes our task, Dasein is not only the primary entity to be interrogated. It is also that entity which already comports itself in its being towards what we are asking about when we ask this question. But in that case the question of being is nothing other than the radicalization of an essential tendency of being, which belongs to Dasein itself, the pre-ontological understanding of being. Introduction 2. The twofold task in working out the question of being. Method and design of our investigation. Section 5. The ontological analytic of Dasein as laying bare the horizon for an interpretation of the meaning of being in general. In designating the tasks of formulating the question of being, we have shown not only that we must establish which entity is to serve as our primary object of interrogation, but also that the right way of access to this entity is one which we must explicitly make our own and hold secure. We have already discussed which entity takes over the principal role within the question of being. But how are we, as it were, to set our sights towards this entity, Dasein, both as something accessible to us and as something to be understood and interpreted? In demonstrating that Dasein in ontico-ontologically prior, we have misled the reader into supposing that this entity must also be what is given as ontico-ontologically primary, not only in the sense that it can itself be grasped immediately, but also in that the kind of being which it possesses is presented just as immediately. Ontically, of course, Dasein is not only close to us, even that which is closest, we are it. Each of us, we ourselves. In spite of this, or rather, for just this reason, it is ontologically that which is farthest. To be sure, its ownmost being is such that it has an understanding of that being, and already maintains itself in each case as if its being has been interpreted in some manner. But we are certainly not saying that when Dasein's own being is thus interpreted pre-ontologically in the way which lies closest, this interpretation can be taken over as an appropriate clue, as if this way of understanding being is what must emerge when one's ownmost state of being is considered as an ontological theme. The kind of being which belongs to Dasein is rather such that, in understanding its own being, it has a tendency to do so in terms of that entity towards which it comports itself proximally, and in a way which is essentially constant, in terms of the world. In Dasein itself, and therefore in its own understanding of being, the way the world is understood, as we shall show, reflected back ontologically upon the way in which Dasein itself gets interpreted. Thus, because Dasein is ontico-ontologically prior, its own specific state of being, if we understand this in the sense of Dasein's categorial structure, remains concealed from it. Dasein is ontically closest to itself and ontologically farthest, but pre-ontologically it is surely not a stranger. Here we have merely indicated provisionally that an interpretation of this entity is confronted with peculiar difficulties, grounded in the kind of being which belongs to the object taken as our theme, and to the very behaviour of so taking it. These difficulties are not grounded in any shortcomings of the cognitive powers with which we are endowed, or in the lack of a suitable way of conceiving, a lack which seemingly would not be hard to remedy. Not only, however, does an understanding of being belong to Dasein, but this understanding develops or decays along with whatever kind of being Dasein may possess at the time. Accordingly, there are many ways in which it has been interpreted, and these are all at Dasein's disposal. Dasein's way of behaviour, its capacities, powers, possibilities, and vicissitudes have been studied with varying extent in philosophical psychology, in anthropology, ethics, and political science, in poetry, biography, and in the writing of history, each in a different fashion. But the question remains whether these interpretations of Dasein have been carried through with a primordial existentiality comparable to whatever existentielle primordiality they may have possessed. Neither of these excludes the other, but they do not necessarily go together. Existentielle interpretation can demand an existential analytic, if indeed we conceive of philosophical cognition as something possible and necessary. Only when the basic structures of Dasein have been adequately worked out, with explicit orientation towards the problem of being itself, will what we have hitherto gained in interpreting Dasein get its existential justification. Thus, an analytic of Dasein must remain our first requirement in the question of being. But in that case, the problem of obtaining and securing the kind of access which will lead to Dasein becomes even more a burning one. To put it negatively, we have no right to resort to dogmatic constructions, and to apply just any idea of being and actuality to this entity, no matter how self-evident that idea may be. Nor may any of the categories which such an idea prescribes be forced upon Dasein without proper ontological consideration. We must rather choose such a way of access and such a kind of interpretation that this entity can show itself in itself and from itself, an ihm selbst, von ihm selbst her. And this means that it is to be shown as it is proximally, and for the most part, in its average everydayness. In this everydayness there are certain structures which we shall exhibit, not just any accidental structures, but essential ones which in every kind of being that factical Dasein may possess, persist as determinative for the character of its being. Thus, by having regard for the basic state of Dasein's everydayness, we shall bring out the being of this entity in a preparatory fashion. When taken in this way, the analytic of Dasein remains wholly oriented towards the guiding task of working out the question of being. Its limits are thus determined. It cannot attempt to provide a complete ontology of Dasein, which assuredly must be constructed, if anything like a philosophical anthropology is to have a philosophically adequate basis. If our purpose is to make such an anthropology possible, or to lay its ontological foundations, our interpretation will provide only some of the pieces, even though they are by no means inessential ones. Our analysis of Dasein, however, is not only incomplete, it is also, in the first instance, provisional. It merely brings out the being of this entity, without interpreting its meaning. It is rather a preparatory procedure by which the horizon for the most primordial way of interpreting being may be laid bare. Once we have arrived at that horizon, this preparatory analytic of Dasein will have to be repeated on a higher and authentically ontological basis. We shall point to temporality as the meaning of the being of that entity which we call Dasein. If this is to be demonstrated, those structures of Dasein which we shall provisionally exhibit must be interpreted over again as modes of temporality. In thus interpreting Dasein as temporality, however, we shall not give the answer to our leading question as to the meaning of being in general, but the ground will have been prepared for obtaining such an answer. We have already intimated that Dasein has a pre-ontological being as its ontically constitutive state. Dasein is in such a way as to be something which understands something like being. Keeping this interconnection firmly in mind, we shall show that whenever Dasein tacitly understands and interprets something like being, it does so with time as its standpoint. Time must be brought to light and genuinely conceived as the horizon for all understanding of being and for any way of interpreting it. In order for us to discern this, time needs to be explicated primordially as the horizon for the understanding of being, and in terms of temporality as the being of Dasein, which understands being. This task as a whole requires that the conception of time thus obtained shall be distinguished from the way in which it is ordinarily understood. This ordinary way of understanding it has become explicit in an interpretation precipitated in the traditional concept of time, which has persisted from Aristotle to Bergson and even later. Here we must make clear that this conception of time, and in general the ordinary way of understanding it, have sprung from temporality, and we must show how this has come about. We shall thereby restore to the ordinary conception the autonomy which is its rightful due, as against Bergson's thesis that the time one has in mind in this conception is space. Time has long functioned as an ontological, or rather an ontical, criterion for naively discriminating various realms of entities. A distinction has been made between temporal entities, natural processes and historical happenings, and non-temporal entities, spatial and numerical relationships. We're accustomed to contrasting the timeless meaning of propositions with the temporal course of propositional assertions. It is also held that there is a cleavage between temporal entities and the supra-temporal eternal, and efforts are made to bridge this over. Here, temporal always means simply being, seiend, in time, a designation which admittedly is still pretty obscure. The fact remains that time, in the sense of being, sein, in time, functions as a criterion for distinguishing realms of being. Hitherto no one has asked or troubled to investigate how time has come to have this distinctive ontological function, or with what right anything like time functions as such a criterion. Nor has anyone asked whether the authentic ontological relevance which is possible for it gets expressed when time is used in so naively ontological a manner. Time has acquired this self-evident ontological function of its own accord, so to speak. Indeed, it has done so within the horizon of the way it is ordinarily understood, and it has maintained itself in this function to this day. In contrast to all this, our treatment of the question of the meaning of being must enable us to show that the central problematic of all ontology is rooted in the phenomenon of time, if rightly seen and rightly explained. And we must show how this is the case. If being is to be conceived in terms of time, and if indeed its various modes and derivatives are to become intelligible in their respective modifications and derivations by taking time into consideration, then being itself, and not merely entities, let us say, as entities in time, is thus made visible in its temporal character. But in that case, temporal can no longer mean simply being in time. Even the non-temporal and the supra-temporal are temporal with regard to their being, and not just privatively by contrast with something temporal as an entity in time, but in a positive sense, though it is one which we must first explain. In both pre-philosophical and philosophical usage, the expression temporal has been preempted by the signification we have cited. In the following investigations, however, we shall employ it for another signification. Thus, the way in which being and its modes and characteristics have their meaning determined primordially in terms of time is what we shall call its temporal determinateness. Thus the fundamental ontological task of interpreting being as such includes working out the temporality of being. In the exposition of the problematic of temporality, the question of the meaning of being will first be concretely answered. Because being cannot be grasped except by taking time into consideration, the answer to the question of being cannot lie in any proposition that is blind and isolated. The answer is not properly conceived if what it asserts propositionally is just passed along, especially if it gets circulated as a free-floating result, so that we merely get informed about a standpoint which may perhaps differ from the way this has hitherto been treated. Whether the answer is a new one remains quite superficial and is of no importance. Its positive character must lie in its being ancient enough for us to learn to conceive the possibilities which the ancients have made ready for us. In its ownmost meaning, this answer tells us that concrete ontological research must begin with an investigative inquiry, which keeps within the horizon we have laid bare, and this is all that it tells us. If, then, the answer to the question of being is to provide the clues for our research, it cannot be adequate until it brings us the insight that the specific kind of being of ontology hitherto, and the vicissitudes of its inquiries, its findings and its failures, have been necessitated in the very character of Dasein. Section 6. The task of destroying the history of ontology. All research, and not least that which operates within the range of the central question of being, is an ontical possibility of Dasein. Dasein's being finds its meaning in temporality, but temporality is also the condition which makes historicality possible as a temporal kind of being which Dasein itself possesses, regardless of whether or how Dasein is an entity in time. Historicality as a determinate character is prior to what is called history, world historical historizing. Historicality stands for the state of being that is constitutive for Dasein's historizing as such. Only on the basis of such historizing is anything like world history possible, or can anything belong historically to world history. In its factical being, any Dasein is as it already was, and it is what it already was. It is its past, whether explicitly or not. And this is so not only in that its past is, as it were, pushing itself along behind it, and that Dasein possesses what is past as a property which is still present at hand, and which sometimes has after-effects upon it. Dasein is its past in the way of its own being, which, to put it roughly, historizes out of its future on each occasion. Whatever the way of being it may have at the time, and thus with whatever understanding of being it may possess, Dasein has grown up both into and in a traditional way of interpreting itself. In terms of this it understands itself proximally, and with a certain range constantly. By this understanding the possibilities of its being are disclosed and regulated. Its own past, and this always means the past of its generation, is not something which follows along after Dasein, but something which already goes ahead of it. The elemental historicality of Dasein may remain hidden from Dasein itself, but there is a way by which it can be discovered and given proper attention. Dasein can discover tradition, preserve it, and study it explicitly. The discovery of tradition and the disclosure of what it transmits and how this is transmitted can be taken hold of as a task in its own right. In this way, Dasein brings itself into the kind of being which consists in historiological inquiry and research. But historiology, or more precisely, historicity, is possible as a kind of being which the inquiring Dasein may possess only because historicality is a determining characteristic for Dasein in the very basis of its being. If this historicality remains hidden from Dasein, and as long as it so remains, Dasein is also denied the possibility of historiological inquiry, or the discovery of history. If historiology is wanting, this is not evidence against Dasein's historicality. On the contrary, as a deficient mode of this state of being, it is evidence for it. Only because it is historical can an era be unhistoriological. On the other hand, if Dasein has seized upon its latent possibility not only of making its own existence transparent to itself, but also of inquiring into the meaning of existentiality itself, that is to say, of previously inquiring into the meaning of being in general, and if by such inquiry its eyes have been opened to its own essential historicality, then one cannot fail to see that the inquiry into being, the ontico-ontological necessity of which we have already indicated, is itself characterized by historicality. The ownmost meaning of being, which belongs to the inquiry into being as an historical inquiry, gives us the assignment, Anweisung, of inquiring into the history of that inquiry itself, that is, of becoming historiological. In working out the question of being, we must heed this assignment, so that by positively making the past our own, we may bring ourselves into full possession of the ownmost possibilities of such inquiry. The question of the meaning of being must be carried through by explicating Dasein beforehand, in its temporality and historicality. The question thus brings itself to the point where it understands itself as historiological. Our preparatory interpretation of the fundamental structures of Dasein with regard to the average kind of being which is closest to it, a kind of being in which it is therefore proximally historical as well, will make manifest, however, not only that Dasein is inclined to fall back upon its world, the world in which it is, and to interpret itself in terms of that world by its reflected light, but also that Dasein simultaneously falls prey to the tradition of which it has more or less explicitly taken hold. This tradition keeps it from providing its own guidance, whether in inquiring or in choosing. This holds true, and by no means least, for that understanding which is rooted in Dasein's ownmost being, and for the possibility of developing it, namely for ontological understanding. When tradition thus becomes master, it does so in such a way that what it transmits is made so inaccessible, proximally and for the most part, that it rather becomes concealed. Tradition takes what has come down to us and delivers it over to self-evidence. It blocks our access to those primordial sources from which the categories and concepts handed down to us have been in part quite genuinely drawn. Indeed, it makes us forget that they have had such an origin, and makes us suppose that the necessity of going back to these sources is something which we need not even understand. Dasein has had its historicality so thoroughly uprooted by tradition that it confines its interest to the multiformity of possible types, directions, and standpoints of philosophical activity in the most exotic and alien of cultures, and by this very interest it seeks to veil the fact that it has no ground of its own to stand on. Consequently, despite all its historiological interests and all its zeal for an interpretation which is philologically objective, sachliche, Dasein no longer understands the most elementary conditions which would alone enable it to go back to the past in a positive manner and make it productively its own. We have shown at the outset, Section 1, not only that the question of the meaning of being is one that has not been attended to, and one that has been inadequately formulated, but that it has become quite forgotten in spite of all our interest in metaphysics. Greek ontology and its history, which, in their numerous filiations and distortions, determine the conceptual character of philosophy even today, prove that when Dasein understands either itself or being in general, it does so in terms of the world, and that the ontology which has thus arisen has deteriorated, verfällt, to a tradition in which it gets reduced to something self-evident, merely material for reworking as it was for Hegel. In the Middle Ages, this uprooted Greek ontology became a fixed body of doctrine. Its systematics, however, is by no means a mere joining together of traditional pieces into a single edifice. Though its basic conceptions of being have been taken over dogmatically from the Greeks, a great deal of unpretentious work has been carried on further within these limits. With the peculiar character which the scholastics gave it, Greek ontology has, in its essentials, travelled the path that leads through the Disputationes Metaphysicae of Suarez to the metaphysics and transcendental philosophy of modern times, determining even the foundations and the aims of Hegel's logic. In the course of this history, certain distinctive domains of being have come into view and have served as the primary guides for subsequent problematics. The ego cogito of Descartes, the subject, the I, reason, spirit, person. But these all remain uninterrogated as to their being and its structure, in accordance with the thoroughgoing way in which the question of being has been neglected. It is rather the case that the categorical content of the traditional ontology has been carried over to these entities with corresponding formalizations and purely negative restrictions, or else dialectic has been called in for the purpose of interpreting the substantiality of the subject ontologically. If the question of being is to have its own history made transparent, then this hardened tradition must be loosened up, and the concealments which it has brought about must be dissolved. We understand this task as one in which, by taking the question of being as our clue, we are to destroy the traditional content of ancient ontology until we arrive at those primordial experiences in which we achieved our first ways of determining the nature of being, the ways which have guided us ever since. In thus demonstrating the origin of our basic ontological concepts by an investigation in which their birth certificate is displayed, we have nothing to do with a vicious relativizing of ontological standpoints. But this destruction is just as far from having the negative sense of shaking off the ontological tradition. We must, on the contrary, stake out the positive possibilities of that tradition, and this always means keeping it within its limits. These, in turn, are given factically in the way the question is formulated at the time, and in the way the possible field for investigation is thus bounded off. On its negative side, this destruction does not relate itself towards the past. Its criticism is aimed at today, and at the prevalent way of treating the history of ontology, whether it is headed towards doxography, towards intellectual history, or towards a history of problems. But to bury the past in nullity, Nichtigkeit, is not the purpose of this destruction. Its aim is positive. Its negative function remains unexpressed and indirect. The destruction of the history of ontology is essentially bound up with the way the question of being is formulated, and it is possible only within such a formulation. In the framework of our treatise, which aims at working out that question in principle, we can carry out this destruction only with regard to stages of that history which are, in principle, decisive. In line with the positive tendencies of this destruction, we must in the first instance raise the question whether, and to what extent, the interpretation of being and the phenomenon of time have been brought together thematically in the course of the history of ontology, and whether the problematic of temporality required for this has ever been worked out in principle, or ever could have been. The first and only person who has gone any stretch of the way towards investigating the dimension of temporality, or has even let himself be drawn hither by the coercion of the phenomena themselves, is Kant. Only when we have established the problematic of temporality can we succeed in casting light on the obscurity of his doctrine of the schematism. But this will also show us why this area is one which had to remain closed off to him in its real dimensions, and in its central ontological function. Kant himself was aware that he was venturing into an area of obscurity. This schematism of our understanding as regards appearances and their mere form is an art hidden in the depths of the human soul, the true devices of which are hardly ever to be divined from nature and laid uncovered before our eyes. Here Kant shrinks back, as it were, in the face of something which must be brought to light as a theme and a principle if the expression being is to have any demonstrable meaning. In the end, those very phenomena which will be exhibited under the heading of temporality in our analysis are precisely those most covert judgments of the common reason for which Kant says it is the business of philosophers to provide an analytic. In pursuing this task of destruction with the problematic of temporality as our clue, we shall try to interpret the chapter on the schematism and the Kantian doctrine of time, taking that chapter as our point of departure. At the same time, we shall show why Kant could never achieve an insight into the problematic of temporality. There were two things that stood in his way. In the first place, he altogether neglected the problem of being, and in connection with this, he failed to provide an ontology with Dasein as its theme, or, to put this in Kantian language, to give a preliminary ontological analytic of the subjectivity of the subject. Instead of this, Kant took over Descartes' position quite dogmatically, notwithstanding all the essential respects in which he had gone beyond him. Furthermore, in spite of the fact that he was bringing the phenomenon of time back into the subject again, his analysis of it remained oriented towards the traditional way in which time had been ordinarily understood. In the long run, this kept him from working out the phenomenon of a transcendental determination of time in its own structure and function. Because of this double effect of tradition, the decisive connection between time and the I think was shrouded in utter darkness. It did not even become a problem. In taking over Descartes' ontological position, Kant made an essential omission. He failed to provide an ontology of Dasein. This omission was a decisive one in the spirit, im Sinne, of Descartes' ownmost tendencies. With the cogito sum, Descartes had claimed that he was putting philosophy on a new and firm footing. But what he left undetermined when he began in this radical way was the kind of being which belongs to the res cogitans, the thing which thinks, or more precisely the meaning of the being of the sum. By working out the unexpressed ontological foundations of the cogito sum, we shall complete our sojourn at the second station along the path of our destructive retrospect of the history of ontology. Our interpretation will not only prove that Descartes had to neglect the question of being altogether, it will also show why he came to suppose that the absolute being certain, Gewissensein, of the cogito exempted him from raising the question of the meaning of the being which this entity possesses. Yet Descartes not only continued to neglect this, and thus to accept a completely indefinite ontological status for the res cogitans, sive mens sive animus, the thing which cognizes whether it be a mind or spirit, he regarded this entity as a fundamentum inconcussum, firm foundation, and applied the medieval ontology to it in carrying through the fundamental considerations of his Meditationes. He defined the res cogitans, the thing which thinks, ontologically as an ens, entity, and in the medieval ontology the meaning of being for such an ens had been fixed by understanding it as an ens creatum, a created entity. God as ens infinitum, an infinite entity, was the ens in creatum, an entity not created. But createdness, Geschaffenheit in the widest sense of something's having been produced, Hergestelltheit, was an essential item in the structure of the ancient conception of being. The seemingly new beginning which Descartes proposed for philosophizing has revealed itself as the implantation of a baleful prejudice, which has kept later generations from making any thematic ontological analytic of the mind, Gemütes, such as would take the question of being as a clue, and would at the same time come to grips critically with the traditional ancient ontology. Everyone who is acquainted with the Middle Ages sees that Descartes is dependent upon medieval scholasticism, and employs its terminology. But with this discovery nothing is achieved philosophically as long as it remains obscure to what a profound extent the medieval ontology has influenced the way in which posterity has determined, or failed to determine, the ontological character of the res cogitans. The full extent of this cannot be estimated until both the meaning and the limitations of the ancient ontology have been exhibited in terms of an orientation directed towards the question of being, In other words, in our process of destruction, we find ourselves faced with the task of interpreting the basis of the ancient ontology in the light of the problematic of temporality. When this is done, it will be manifest that the ancient way of interpreting the being of entities is oriented towards the world, or nature, in the widest sense, and that it is indeed in terms of time that its understanding of being is obtained. The outward evidence for this, though of course it is merely outward evidence, is the treatment of the meaning of being as parousia, or ousia, which signifies in ontologico-temporal terms presence, Anwesenheit. Entities are grasped in their being as presence. This means that they are understood with regard to a definite mode of time, the present. The problematic of Greek ontology, like that of any other, must take its clues from Dasein itself. In both ordinary and philosophical usage, Dasein, man's being, is defined as zoon logon echon, as that living thing whose being is essentially determined by the potentiality for discourse. Legein, using discourse, is the clue for arriving at those structures of being which belong to the entities we encounter in addressing ourselves to anything or speaking about it. This is why the ancient ontology, as developed by Plato, turns into dialectic. As the ontological clue gets progressively worked out, namely in the hermeneutic of the logos, word, discourse, it becomes increasingly possible to grasp the problem of being in a more radical fashion. The dialectic, which has been a genuine philosophical embarrassment, becomes superfluous. That is why Aristotle no longer has any understanding of it, for he has put it on a more radical footing and raised it to a new level, Aufhob. Legein, discourse itself, or rather that simple awareness of something present at hand in its sheer presence at hand, which Parmenides had already taken to guide him in his own interpretation of being, has the temporal structure of a pure making present of something. Those entities which show themselves in this and for it, and which are understood as entities in the most authentic sense, thus get interpreted with regard to the present, that is, they are conceived as presence, ousia. Yet the Greeks have managed to interpret being in this way without any explicit knowledge of the clues which function here, without any acquaintance with the fundamental ontological function of time or even any understanding of it, and without any insight into the reason why this function is possible. On the contrary, they take time itself as one entity among other entities, and try to grasp it in the structure of its being, though that way of understanding being, which they have taken as their horizon, is one which is itself naively and inexplicitly oriented towards time. Within the framework in which we are about to work out the principles of the question of being, we cannot present a detailed temporal interpretation of the foundations of ancient ontology, particularly not of its loftiest and purest scientific stage, which is reached in Aristotle. Instead, we shall give an interpretation of Aristotle's essay on time, which may be chosen as providing a way of discriminating the basis and the limitations of the ancient science of being. Aristotle's essay on time is the first detailed interpretation of this phenomenon, which has come down to us. Every subsequent account of time, including Bergson's, has been essentially determined by it. When we analyze the Aristotelian conception, it will likewise become clear, as we go back, that the Kantian account of time operates within the structures which Aristotle has set forth. This means that Kant's basic ontological orientation remains that of the Greeks, in spite of all the distinctions which arise in a new inquiry. The question of being does not achieve its true concreteness until we have carried through the process of destroying the ontological tradition. In this way we can fully prove that the question of the meaning of being is one that we cannot avoid, and we can demonstrate what it means to talk about restating this question. In any investigation in this field where the thing itself is deeply veiled, one must take pains not to overestimate the results. For in such an inquiry one is constantly compelled to face the possibility of disclosing an even more primordial and more universal horizon from which we may draw the answer to the question, what is being? We can discuss such possibilities seriously and with positive results only if the question of being has been reawakened and we have arrived at a field where we can come to terms with it in a way that can be controlled. 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 Controlled.